Hey, welcome to the channel. My name's Tyler. Your name is Regina?
Regina Phalange.
So in the last video, I discussed some tips on how to improve our line work. So if you haven't checked that out and you're interested, check that out. I'll link it in the description and at the end of this video. And I had a bonus tip that's a little bit out there and it's not necessarily for beginners, so I figured I'd make it a separate video. It's something that I call artefacting, and it's essentially creative mark making, often derived from the leftover remnants of an initial sketch, or the artifacts of an initial sketch. Basically, it can add some nice visual interest to your sketches. So let's take a look at some examples. So the first example of artifacting that I have is also the most commonly used, and the example I have is from Loish van Barle, or better known as Loish. And in this example, what Loish has done is left in some of the initial line work from her original sketch. You can see all of these little lines here that they're still in there. Those are left in from her original sketch, and it adds a nice movement and liveliness to her drawing. If we take a look at the initial sketch here, you can see that some of these lines are still, they're the exact same lines that are still in there. See all this stuff here, these little orangey lines? Those are the exact same lines. She just did not get rid of them. She did lower the opacity a little bit. I've seen her process before and she does lower the opacity, so that is one thing. And the other thing to note is she does clean it up where needed. So this can get very messy very quickly if you do it wrong. But you want to do some cleanup where needed. So you can see that the face, which is our focal point, is actually a lot cleaner than in the initial sketch. And these lines do not appear in the face because in that area, these lines are too loose. So Loish has erased those out and fixed up that area of the drawing. But in other areas where it doesn't matter as much, she's left it loose. And as I said, it just adds a nice movement and liveliness to the drawing. So you do see this a lot where there's just remnants of the initial sketch. So here are some more sketches that Loish did in her actual sketchbook. And you can see that these are the initial searching lines or gesture lines. So you can think of it as gesture drawing. And they're just left in, which shows the initial energy of the sketch. And I know I'm going to be a bit of a broken record repeating this, but you want to be careful about how you apply this. If you have too many searching lines or they're too chaotic, it's just going to confuse the viewer. So you want to use this fairly minimally if you can. Next, we're going to look at Michal. So the way that Michal does it, I actually wouldn't really call it artefacting, but it's similar. What he does is adds a lot of little interesting line work that are very small. They're kind of detail-y. But what they're doing is indicating material. He does a lot of beat up metal and that kind of stuff. So it's just little marks. And some of them are like little ticks. You can see they're just like little random ticks. And I believe that he does this as he's drawing. It's not necessarily a remnant of an initial sketch. So again, maybe this isn't the best example as artefacting, but it sort of gives you the same visual noise that is interesting. And again, you can overdo this very quickly. So you have to be careful. And there's a note there to be careful of. This works really well for dirty, grungy stuff that's maybe beat up, or natural things like tree bark and rocks and anything that's very textury. But obviously you don't want this kind of artifacting if you're doing very clean lines, if you're doing sleek, futuristic designs. Obviously you don't want that kind of noise because it makes it look messy. And if you're going for a clean design, you don't want that messiness. Another example is Feng. Now, Feng is interesting because he does sort of a combination of what Loish does and what Michal does. You can see he gets a lot of this like little pointy, just kind of scratchy type stuff that Michal has. And in a lot of cases, Feng does get it from his initial sketch. You can see a lot of these, there's some straight lines in here where he was doing a bit of perspective work that he leaves in. And then you can see a lot of this stuff here, that kind of stuff was in his original sketch. He's probably going for like contour lines. And then he erases it, but he does sort of a sloppy job. And I'm not criticizing him, but he just does a bit of a sloppier job. And what happens is as he's erasing, it's imperfect and it leaves these little marks left over that remain in his drawing. And it leaves that initial energy that's in his first sketch. And then I'm pretty sure he also physically draws in some when he's doing his cleanup drawing, the way that I think Michal does as well. So he's sort of doing both initial sketch and afterwards adding that sort of patina and detail to the sketch. So you can see Feng is a bit of an extreme version of it, and I would say be extra careful. Maybe don't try to emulate his style because you have to be very, very careful about how you do it. I think it can go wrong very easily, so take it with a huge grain of salt. I would say don't try Feng's method, but just to show you. You can see here the back foot gets no detail, no line weight too, to go back to the line weight stuff. But you can see this is probably just his original sketch, didn't clean it up at all, but you can still see these lines in the front foot too. You can basically see that same sketch in here, and he's cleaned it up a little bit, but not much, and it just gives you that lively energy in there. Now Feng talks about this in his videos where he calls it first generation drawing, and essentially what he means is refining the initial sketch that you do. A lot of artists will do their initial sketch on one layer and then lower the opacity and do a cleanup layer on top of that. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But as Feng mentions, you sometimes lose the initial energy that was in your first sketch. So by leaving in some of the initial marks and just cleaning up that first sketch, it helps to retain some of that energy. That doesn't mean you can't do a second cleanup layer. It's just something to be aware of. Another way to do that is if you want to do a cleanup layer, maybe duplicate the initial sketch and that will become your cleanup layer. Next we have an artist who goes by Artem Solop, and you can see their work is absolutely amazing. It's super cool. Now we're getting really heavy into this kind of artifacting where it's very, very deliberate mark making. It's essentially crazy shapes and artifacts that present themselves on the page, sort of surrounding the drawing and overlapping it. And there's just so much energy and interest here. This is starting to lean heavily into some comic book styles with the writing that pops up in the background that we see. It's also got a lot of graffiti influence too. We can see a lot of this interesting mark making in graffiti as well. So that's a whole other lane that we could go down to explore this kind of stuff. I won't go too far down that road. We'll just take a look at this. But if you're interested in this kind of look, definitely look at things like graffiti and comic books. And then changing it up a little bit is Trent Kaniuaga. I find Trent's style very cool because he does this all in one shot. If you watch his videos, he sort of paints and renders and draws all simultaneously. But his version of artifacting is leaving some of the line work in his finished render, which of course a lot of people do. But it's just interesting that Trent does that where it's quote unquote left over from a line drawing, even though he does it all in one shot. So he's purposefully injecting what looks like the artifact of a line drawing into his render. It's just a different way of doing this artifact idea that I find very interesting. You can see in this Ninja Troll piece that Trent did, there's also things like paint splatters and just random like little dots. Sometimes there's artifacts of particular brushes that are left in that are very stampy, but they're left in a very particular manner that really helps add visual interest to the piece. So that's essentially what I'm calling artifacting, is just interesting visual mark making. With this video, I want to focus a little more on line work because I think it's an easier concept to understand just looking at lines. Once we get into painting, you could make an argument that any interesting brush stroke or brush marks, custom shapes, that kind of stuff is kind of all artifacting maybe. So that's sort of opening the floodgates. So I don't really want to get too deep into that, but I'll show you some examples where it starts getting into painting. To take Trent's work even further, we can look at Marco Bucci, which is full painting, and you can see that he does the same thing with different brushes and mark making. You get all these little random artifacts that are very interesting. You get the like rake tool in here with the different lines going here. A lot of people use this halftone comic book dot kind of thing in their painting, and they'll leave that in just a little bit. You don't want much of it. If you overdo it, it'll look terrible. But if you use it a little bit, it becomes a nice little artifact in the drawing. So you can see it looks like Marco used it to actually soften this hard edge here, which is just super interesting. It's a soft edge by virtue of a custom brush, which is just super interesting. Okay, so those are some examples of what I call artifacting. It probably exists under a different name, I'm not too sure. If you've heard of a different term for this, or you have different examples of how some other artists do something similar, let me know in the comments. I don't know, I like artifacting. I think we should make it a thing. Thanks so much for watching, like and subscribe and all that stuff. As always, if you've got ideas for future content that you'd like to see me cover, let me know in the comments. Be good to one another, and I'll see you next time. Okay, bye.